Hey everyone, something a bit different while the Pan-Europeans managed to find its way off the lift. This is my other half's Interceptor 650. She absolutely loves it and we both ride all year. So as you can see, it's getting a little bit crusty. While I've got it up on the lift, given it's such a popular bike with new riders, I thought I would go through it and take you along for the ride while I find all of the crap traps and important maintenance spots on the bike. A brief disclaimer, I'm going to talk a lot about salt in this video. No, we don't season our motorbikes. I'm in the UK. And over here, we put rock salt on the roads when they're icy to melt the ice and allow people to drive around without slipping and sliding. That's because we don't have rules about winter tyres, and we don't get that much icy weather comparatively. Maybe only a couple of weeks of the year is actually required. Part of the problem with putting rock salt on the roads is that it increases the speed of corrosion anywhere that it gets, because it mixes with water and creates a saline solution. That's why I talk about salt so much and getting salt off the bike. If you are in a place where they don't use rock salt on the roads, congratulations. I think it's probably a better idea and your vehicles will last an awful lot longer. Now back to the video. First things first, a note on caring for spoked wheels. Spoked wheels are much easier to clean if you do it regularly. If you let them get in a horrible state and the spokes start to corrode, you're going to have to sit here with a tube of Autosol and polish each one back up. The most important part when cleaning spokes is to make sure you get all the way around them, especially where they cross here. The spokes touch, they do on almost all spoked wheels, although some they don't, and grime and salt can get in between here. Make sure when you're rinsing the bike down after giving it a clean outside that you give it a thorough rinse. You might even be able to get yourself a microfiber or something else between them and just wipe out that gap. A toothbrush is quite good for this, and you can buy them for absolutely dirt cheap at Aldi or Lidl. Also, while you're here, a lot of people will put something on the spoke nipples to stop them corroding. WD-40 is popular, different kinds of grease, ACF50, whatever you're doing, while you're waving your greasy rag around, make sure you don't get it on your brakes, because then you won't be able to stop and you'll die. So next most important area to look at, this is your front suspension. These are the stanchions. You always want to make sure that these are clean and free of dirt and salt, because over time they will pit and corrode, and once that happens, it's expensive to fix. Next, down here, you want to make sure that there's no dirt or crud stuck around these seals. A lot of people use a lot of different things for this. I'll get WD-40 or more preferably silicone oil, and just make sure they're given a good flush. Again, make sure when you're working around here that you don't get any of this stuff on your brakes. Now you can jump up, you can pump the suspension a bit. You just want to make sure that any dirt that's caught around here is flushed out now before it finds its way under this dust seal into the main seals and causes a leak. While we're here, up here around these clamps, dirt and water will have a tendency to sit, so make sure you wipe that out. And again, your anti-corrosion solution of choice, just a little bit. You can see it's going to snake around and find its way down into that gap, and that should displace any water that's in there. A common misconception, by the way, about this stuff is that it's a release agent or a penetrating fluid. WD-40 does a lot of different things, but what that actually means is water displacer type 40. Its most useful thing it does is push water out of places it shouldn't be. So you put WD-40 anywhere you want to push water out of, except on your brakes, because then you'll die. This kind of theme of finding the little nooks and crannies that stuff gets stuck continues up here. So these bolt heads, you want to make sure that there's nothing in them. Sticky and horrible salt will sit in there, it will corrode these out. Because these are Allen heads, if these get corroded out inside, you're going to have a horrible time trying to undo them if you ever need to. The same applies on this bike for the upward facing Allen heads here. They have a tendency to act as a little cup and collect water and road slime. And then looking up a little bit further, you by now have got the idea of the game. There's going to be plenty of little places in here where stuff is going to catch. So we've got an extra set of clamps here, so crud is going to get stuck around here and it's going to sit against this fork and pit the stanchion. Up here it's not so much of a problem because it's not the working part of your suspension, but if you've got a bike this pretty, you probably want to keep it pretty. I'm going to move down to the brakes now. So for starters, this is now no longer our friend, although we are going to need it later. We are going to want brake cleaner. So a lot of you will be buying brake cleaner in spray cans that you use just like this WD-40 can. to clean out your brakes. I have something a little bit different behind me. This is an air-powered stuff sprayer. It'll spray whatever's in here. They're called paraffin sprayers, but I don't use any of them to spray paraffin. And what I have is a very big tub of liquid brake and clutch cleaner. It's a lot cheaper to buy it that way and spray it on than it is to keep buying the aerosol cans. If you don't have access to air tools, which I haven't for most of my life, get a garden pump sprayer. You can buy ones directly from automotive manufacturers that already have the right seals in them so that they don't decay in the presence of the brake and clutch cleaner, because it's an incredibly powerful solvent. But with this, you just want to make sure that you blow out any crud that's sat on the brakes. This stuff flashes off really quickly so it won't stay wet. Do try and avoid getting it on plastics and rubbers, because it has a tendency to decay them a little bit quicker than they otherwise would. And once you've done this, you can then go around extremely carefully, and anywhere that there might be water traps or salt traps on the brakes, so for this bike it's around the back of this nut, it gets all furry. I tend to, while holding a rag and very gently actuating the foaming bit of this nozzle, get some WD-40 around it, let it work its way in, and then make absolutely sure that there is no liquid WD-40 left on the surface of this where it might fall down onto the brake disc. Remember, this is my other half's bike. The last thing I want to do is be responsible for what happens to her if these don't work. Okay, moving backwards on this bike, we've got quite possibly the most vulnerable area for stuff to get stuck. So you want to make sure these unions here on the bottom of the oil cooler, they've got a dip in them. They're right behind the wheel. If you've removed this fender extender that comes from the factory, I strongly recommend putting it back on, because this half moon shape here protects so much of this front of the engine if you're riding all year round. If you just want the bike to look cool and you only ride it in the summer, maybe you don't need to worry. But one of the most important places is right here in these unions, because the stuff they are made of, the collection of different metals here, when salt gets in this gap, it will start to corrode this fitting, and at worst it will make it hard to get off, but at very worst it will make it leak oil, and that's your engine oil. You need that. Next, while we're here, I'll move you to look a little bit further up at the oil cooler itself. So you don't really want to spray much of anything on this, you just want to make sure the grill is clean, give it a check for corrosion on the fins. This foamy stuff here, it's like a foam to make sure that the air doesn't just blow out around the side of it and actually goes through. This will decay over time, so be prepared for that. I don't think it's enormously essential, but I'm not the designer of the bike, so I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe without it the bike overheats. While we're looking up here, the gaps around these bolts here and the heads, you want to make sure that they are clean and dry. And I've put a bit of WD-40 in there. Same for the horns. There's not much you can really do for these, and they don't tend to get particularly filthy because they're sat behind everything else. But just make sure that they're not collecting water in this lip at the bottom here. Next we're going to take a look down. So this is one of the major places that stuff accumulates. And you can see we've got these tubes over the woven oil cooler pipes to stop stuff getting in there. Make sure these are in good nick, because if they stop being in good nick and stuff starts to get through them, it's going to corrode that woven pipe really quickly. On that note, the bottoms of these pipes, as you can see, turn to aluminium. You want to make sure you keep those clean, because the salt sitting on them that sprays off the wheel will corrode those relatively quickly. So from looking down here, if you have the bash plate installed, you're also going to want to make sure that you clear out any crud that sits in the ends of these bolts on the bash plate. And behind them there are some screws that hold the bash plate on. This is a really vulnerable spot. These screws will get stuck and they may well strip out when you try and take that bash plate off. I haven't cleaned the bash plate yet, but you need to. Staying on theme, if we move around, you can see in here probably one of the most important places to pay attention to. This front of the engine gets showered by anything that comes off the wheel. So while we're here, we want to make sure that we go around clean all the stuff, there's a bolt down here you can see where a load of stuff gets stuck behind. And then if you've got engine bars fitted, these bolts down here probably want some kind of WD-40, or if you're ACF 50ing the bike, you can put that down there. You've got another bolt head here, which you need to make sure isn't full of stuff. And then right down here, as you can probably see my fingertip wiggling just there. There's some casting shapes on the front of the engine where these oil cooler pipes go in, which if you can get in there with a toothbrush or something like it, which I think I have back here. These are really good because I think they're cheap Colgate like basics ones. If you heat them up with a heat gun, you can bend them and change the shape. But right down here, a toothbrush is very useful for getting in and moving that dirt. And that's right there where I am. You might not be able to see, so I can get you a better view, is where those oil cooler pipes meet the engine. So right down there. And those unions are as vulnerable as the ones up the top. So make sure you at least check those semi-regularly. Just a quick update from future me. Actually ended up taking this bash plate off in order to get up here and clean this union properly. You can see the drain for the engine sump down here as well. With these bolts, make sure you pop something like Loctite in. It looks like they've got Loctite red on them from the factory, because obviously there are two up here that face downwards, and those will rattle themselves free if you don't. So clean up the threads. Usually I'd use a bit of brake clean to get all of the, well, anything that's on them, oil or otherwise, off, and then a drop of Loctite. Okay, moving back, probably one of the more contentious points on these Enfields are these engine casings. They have a tendency to mar really quickly and easily, so you want to make sure they're kept nice and clean and that salt is not left on them. I go around again with my best friend some WD-40 and start by making sure that the pockets that all of these bolts are in have a little squirt in there, which means that any water that is trapped in there, it's very easy for surface tension to hold water, as you can see with the WD-40. Trap it in there and start to corrode those bolts. Anyone who's dealt with old bikes knows that when you come to an older bike that hasn't been cared for this way, these stick because of the way they screw into aluminium, usually steel bolts. They make a horrible screeching noise when they come out, and if they don't wreck the casing, then you're very lucky. Okay, so once you've been around and you've cleaned out all of those parts, and you've come along and got any of the excess off, you are going to need some of this. For anyone who's worked in any kind of garage, anyone who has had a family member who's into cars or bikes, probably has a nostalgic attachment to the chemical smell of this stuff. This is Auto Salt. It's a metal polish. It looks a bit like toothpaste. I've just got to sniff it. It smells similar to teacup, for anyone who knows what that smells like. And the idea here is that you get this stuff rubbed in, like you would polish any other metal. You want to go polishing until it starts to look better. I'm not going to do it fully here for you, but as you can see, it's starting to shine up. You're probably going to need a lot more than I've got here, and what this is going to do is strip off a lot of the contaminants, a lot of the tarnishing. You can use tools for this, so if you've got a buffing wheel, Auto Sol works well with that. But once you're done, once you think you've polished enough, you're going to leave it until it goes cloudy. Again, very similar to T-cut. Doesn't normally take very long, but it's a freezing cold day today. It's -2 outside, so the garage isn't that warm. And once it starts to go cloudy, you buff it off with for me, the clean side of another cloth, but you can use a whole separate cloth. And that's going to restore a good amount of the luster and take some of the marks away. If you do clean these bikes or get them wet without then drying them off, and they're not treated with something protective, you'll get these sort of smears here where the water has run down and dried. If I give this a good polish with a liberal amount of Auto Sol, and then buff it back off, you'll see that smear is now gone. Once you've done this, you can then reapply something like ACF 50 with a rag to try and prevent the corrosion from carrying on. ACF 50 is anti-corrosion formula 50, and I'm led to believe it was originally designed for the outside of aluminium aircraft. You can get it in a big bottle like this, or a little spray, but the fact that it is intended for aluminium aircraft means it's very good for this kind of thing where there's a lot of aluminium on display. At least I think these are Arai. I haven't checked, but look at. So for all of the shiny bits on the engine, maybe even the bars and the exhaust, you can carry on with this, or your metal polish of choice. Okay, we're taking a brief detour up top. There's not much particularly exciting to do up here. Polish the exhaust and these rings. I actually used Auto Sol on a toothbrush to do these, and as you can see, they look glorious. While you're up here, and you're looking at the bike, it's worth inspecting around here. Excuse my hand, by the way, it's been stained by Angostura bitters. Good New Year, right? Checking around here to make sure that this isn't leaking. Oil would come out here. This is where the cam lives. There was a little tiny bit of weeping on this bike, which I'm led to believe is quite common, but it's no worse than that. If you look down the spark plug hole and there's a load of oil that's weeped down there, then you're going to want to dry it out with some paper towel, spun round into a little tube. You can stick it down, dry up, take the plug out, clean it up, and then get this resealed. While you're here, check underneath the plug to make sure that water hasn't collected down there. If it does, it will corrode the spark plug threads, and you'll have a nightmare getting them out. You might even strip the head, which is never good. For me, what I like to do is get the engine nice and warm, and then spray a very tiny amount of WD-40 or ACF 50 down there, let it off gas, and dry out before I then put the plug lead back in. Do be careful with these on the Interceptor and the Continental. This bit feels quite brittle. It's a very cold day. Doesn't feel like the best quality spark plug lead. So don't go bending it too much. If you need a bit more space, do just take the tank off. When you start pulling this off, hits the seam of the tank. You've got to give it a little bend to get it off. Moving back, there's not much you need to do around the fake carburetor area. Not much stuff gets here. The only place I did find on this that needed cleaning up top here was just this forward face of the plastic airbox. Where we really start to find an area we need to pay close attention to is down here. So as far as I'm aware, the reason these casings are sort of visually separated like this is to make this bike look like it is a pre-unit bike, aka has a separate engine and gearbox. The castings themselves are actually one, but the two parts are sort of made to look separate. And in this valley of different shapes, there are a bunch of places where stuff gets stuck and crud gets stuck. I'm going to have to take you off the tripod to show you those. So the first is down here, where you can see these bolts. You might just see in there to the left of screen, there's kind of a valley area, and then over in front of the starter motor, that gap goes all the way down. And then from the other side, you can just about see where the cable goes into the starter motor. There are a bunch of flat areas with bolts on top, and then back here you've also got these flat areas with bolts, and you've got a nice well in the middle here, which will also get full of stuff. As you can see, I've started cleaning this, but bits of it are still really dirty. So back here, and then you can also see there's sort of a gap here through to the chain and the rear wheel where a whole bunch of stuff has collected. Particularly around bolts like this, you can see the sparkle has started. That kind of sparkly dotty pattern is what happens when road salt sits on metals like these. If you don't catch it now, it will just get worse and worse until it turns dusty. So while you're in here, make sure all of these bolts, I flush the water out from behind them with WD-40. This starter cable, lift it up, check there's not water underneath this rubber boot. Looks nice and clean. And then there's a sheath on that cable, you might just see at the tip of my finger, which can get pulled back and allow water and grime to get blown down that tube and rot the cable out. So make sure you take care of that. If you're going for a more in-depth clean and you don't mind getting your spanners out, you can also take off the rearmost casing here, this one, and get into your chain and sprocket. Gives us a check over, make sure that it's not shark toothed, because one of the bike's major cramp traps is in here, like most in front of the swing arm. You can see, despite the fact this bike's had a good wash, there's quite a bit of road grime and crust in here, which it definitely pays to clean out. And also where it's been sat still after it got washed, you can see some of the links of the chain in here need a bit of a clean as well. It's also useful to inspect this bit of wiring loom, make sure it's also tidied away and squared away so it doesn't come into contact with the chain. One of the downsides of having a very pretty bike is they've had to find places to run things that aren't, you know, modern things like electronics that aren't visible from outside, so there's quite a bit in here. The evaporative control system lives behind there, I think is this tank here. There's quite a bit of wiring on this bike. Some of the clips have started to pop out, so I need to figure out where they're supposed to be. But yeah, worthwhile getting in here and cleaning what you can reach. Like I said, this is probably more one for your infrequent big cleans, but it's this kind of thing that will keep your bike alive for a lot longer than if you don't come in here and clean. There really is no other way to get into this area. You can't get down the top. You can get forward from in the back here, but not easily. And you can't get up from the bottom because the centre stand is in the way. So there you go, just another crap trap to keep an eye on. This side is very much the same. Make sure you prevent any water collecting in here. And I like to just make sure that all of these adjustment points, clean them with a toothbrush, make sure there's no rubbish in the threads. A little bit of white grease or WD-40 around here. I've gone over this with a toothbrush, got all the nonsense out of these splines, because if you ever need to knock this off, the last thing you want is them to be rotted together. And then you can see those same troublesome areas over here. So you need to make sure these are cleaned out. If you have access to an air gun or an air blaster, blowing air down here will blow all of the stuff that collects under the starter motor out. And then you can see a little better over here the areas that might collect stuff. On this side of the engine, there's nothing different to what we discussed on the other side. It's mostly the same thing. Obviously need to do the same thing with the spark plug over here. We're going to move on now to the rear sets and controls. There is a lot of debate about when you clean these, what kind of grease, if any, do you put in? The argument goes like this. If you put a sticky grease that stays consistently sticky in here, stuff is going to blow up off the road, get stuck in the grease and act as carborundum or grinding paste and wear all of these things out. The argument for not putting any grease in there is you're not protecting it, and therefore water can get in there and do the same job and corrode things. My personal preference is a little bit of white lithium grease, because that's what I was taught. Some people, and I have a pot of it over there, prefer boat trailer grease, which is apparently impervious to everything. We'll find out. But one thing that's most important to do, and I do this before I put any grease on, is get all of the gritty nonsense out of areas like this so that it doesn't sand the peg as it goes up and down in regular use, or sand the brake linkage. Sometimes I'll take them apart. There are only R-clips on the back here. Not a big deal. Sometimes I'll use a toothbrush to get in there. Sometimes I'll flush them through with WD-40. But while we're here and looking at this brake mechanism, I've also gone around with a toothbrush here and made sure to get some WD-40 into all of the threads of these brake connectors. Brake connectors are so much easier when you don't have to wrestle them off because of dissimilar metal corrosion, so a little bit of corrosion inhibitor anywhere time you go near them is always a benefit. On this side of the engine, just one thing to note, make sure you clean inside the oil viewing window. That's how you tell whether you've got oil in your engine or not. A bit of water likes to sit in here, and over time it will collect and start creeping down the back of the glass. And I have seen oil leaks happen that way, not on Royal Enfields, but on other bikes. Same ethos applies over here to the gear change, but there's another spline down here, which you want to make sure doesn't get full of stuff, so I've cleaned that out with a toothbrush. I'm not going to talk about the tank for the time being, because where you just clean that like you clean any painted surface. And this bike has some helicopter tape over it because my other half's zips on her inside of her knee vents for scratching it, so that's what you can see here. Don't worry about these horrible scratches there in the propeller tape, helicopter tape. As we move back, I personally like, if I can, to pop the seat off, get these side covers off and clean behind them, because a lot of airflow comes in here and it blows road grime inside. This is where your battery lives and your air filter on one side, and then your toolkit and a few other bits live on the other side. On the Interceptor, if you don't know, you take the other side off. It's got a keyway. You pull a little catch that's like a bonnet release that takes the seat off. And then the one of these that doesn't have this, there's a bolt up here, and then it just pulls off on rubber mounts. We might have a look at that in a minute. So moving towards the back, we've got a jivvy system for luggage here, which has removable racks to keep the bike looking nice. This has a kind of ball bearing release thing here, which I've honestly forgotten how to use. There we go. So I put a bit of boat trailer grease in there to make sure that water doesn't collect. Looking down, obviously chain maintenance is another thing, probably not for the sake of this video, but look it up. There's plenty of instructions on YouTube how to maintain your chain. But the next thing I'm going to take care of is around these bits here, so where this extension for the foot pegs, just making sure that there isn't stuff stuck in the back here, and then particularly down this gully here where I've got accessories clamped onto the frame, also flushing that out with WD-40, getting the salt and road grime out. Then this peg, same as the other two, you might actually be able to hear in this one, I haven't done a good job. Hear that crispy sound? That is road grime collected up in there and slowly but surely sanding away the two surfaces that rub against each other. So that's what we want to avoid. Moving up to the suspension, this castellated piece around here, if you don't know, the load of the suspension is borne on this tab on the side here, and as you turn this, it changes the tension on the spring. This is known as preload because it is set before you put any load on the rear, so it's the same regardless of who or what is sat on the bike or what it's going over. You use a tool that's in the toolkit to turn this, and as this pin rides around, it changes how much it depresses this spring. Kind of looks like a mountain range. If you've ever done these, they're a bit of a pain in the bum to do, because you'll always slip off with that spanner and punch something you didn't want to. But the reason that we're looking at it today is that crud will accumulate all over the shock absorber, and it will accumulate behind there, and then when you go to turn these, they won't want to turn. Again, being careful of the brake discs that lie below, and using a very gentle squeeze on the WD-40. Just, you can see it's all run immediately behind that. We just want to make sure that this always moves when we want it to. And while we're here, cleaning down around the suspension springs as best we can, one of the most useful ways to do this is to get a corner of your towel, tuck it up if you can, and then floss. There we go, I've dropped it already. Finally, on these bikes, because they're nice and pretty, make sure you clean these shiny metal surfaces back here. I don't use auto sol on these because they have an anodized finish, but they don't tend to get that dirty. Most of the nonsense is spraying off the tyre out the back, not up here. While we're up here though, if you've removed any of the grab handles or added any accessories, make sure that you put the bolts back in the bare holes if you've got bare holes, and make sure that they are cleaned off and any crud that's behind them. I'm going to back these out and spray a bit of WD-40, pop them back in again because stuff does spray up here. Okay, so nearly at the end of the bike here, and one of the things I like to take care of on all these Royal Enfields with the boxy rear swing arm is these nuts. Because they stick right out the back, they get absolutely caked in nonsense, so a little bit of WD-40. These are what you use to adjust your chain tension, so you want to make sure that they move nice and cleanly whenever you need them to. So cleaning them off, and then a little bit of white grease to protect them so that these threads don't start to corrode. If you're feeling extra, you can of course take the axles out of the wheels and make sure that the grease in them hasn't picked up any water off the road, because that does happen over time. It's probably about a once a year concern. That brings us nicely to sort of the last few bits on the bike. So up under here, you want to make sure you clean fairly regularly, but it is all plastic, so nothing's going to corrode, except for the heads of any exposed bolts. So make sure you clean those off, and if you're doing ACF 50, make sure they're absolutely coated in it. Moving on to this area up here where the number plate is, make sure you clean around the back of the number plate. These might be plastic screws, but they will still get stuck and strip, and you've never got set when you need them. And then behind these indicators, you've got these holes where you stick a screwdriver to take the lenses off. Make sure you spray plenty of corrosion protection in there, because any rain will get blown. This is the direction of travel of the motorbike. The rain will get blown in there, and sometimes gets blown in behind the lenses if those screws aren't tight as well. I think you can buy little rubber plugs you might be able to stick in there, but you're fighting a losing battle. And then as we come round, the advice on the wheels and the brakes applies from earlier. Same thing as the front. But one of the more interesting places I've found that trouble starts on these bikes is this brake reservoir. Might not be able to see. You can see it's loose again. Every time I get this bike up in the air, this is loose. There is a bolt down there. You can just see it in the middle of the screen. On this bike, it seems to loosen itself. Okay, while you're in here, also make sure you clean off any dirt and muck that's accumulated on top of the swing arm. Check the seams, make sure it's not rusting. And then along here, we've got more of the same. You can see them here. Brake cables and ABS cables. Make sure to clean around those and pop them out of these holders where they are held in, which this one's not. And just clean any muck that's accumulated around them in the holder so that it doesn't erode them over time. Advice on the shocks is the same side to side. And then finally, all bikes with centre stands and exposed underneaths have this problem. Make sure you get down here and clean any stuff that's got stuck in all of these springs. Stick a little bit of white grease on these pivot points. And then there's some emissions control stuff up here on the Interceptor as well. Which tends to get really caked in nonsense. It's mostly made of plastic, but do just give it a check, because I have seen a few reports of stones smashing these to pieces and messing with the emissions control. How much you care about that is up to you. So to get the seat off, we're on the right hand side of the bike. Undo that key, pull down. These rubber lugs will let go. Make sure they're clean and not full of nonsense. Then we've got our toolkit and one side of our battery. The release for the seat is here. Just give it a pull. This bike has a seat off of a Continental with a cowling on it, so yours won't look like this unless you've also done that. And then we're under the seat. Not much to do under here apart from wipe off any road grime. You can stick whatever lube you want of choice in the latch that holds the seat on. So for me, that's going to be boat and trailer grease, as mentioned earlier. Just wiping down any road slime. On this bike, we've got a tail for heated gear. So while we're here, we're going to spray a bit of anti-corrosion stuff in the end and leave the cap off so that it can dry out. And then up at the front of the tank, make sure that you clean this area where the seat presses against the tank, because if road grit gets in here, as the seat moves with you on it, it will rub the paint off the tank. Really common to see on bikes that have done any mileage of any type of any manufacturer, apart from those very few wise ones that design the seats so they don't rub on the tank. There's not a lot you can do for the controls on a modern bike, apart from a little bit of WD-40 or anti-corrosion around all of these banjos for the brakes, cleaning out anywhere that the bars meet up with any accessories, because salt and road grime will get in here, and then polishing your chrome as you normally would. Don't use anything too harsh on these dials, they're relatively easy to scratch, so a nice clean cloth and just some glass cleaner will do the trick. Up around the top of the forks and the yokes here, just cleaning around and making sure that there isn't stuff stuck in around here, as we discussed with the bottom of the forks. If you're running any accessories, making sure they're still tight. So this is a quad lock phone holder. Got them on all of our bikes so that both of our phones fit any bike. Really handy if you're switching between bikes or you regularly share with someone else like I do. Lift these caps up. Make sure your mirrors are tight and maybe stick a little bit of white lithium grease on the threads under here, make sure there's no schmutz trapped too. And then finally, a trick for new players: don't stick WD-40 down your ignition when your key starts to get graunchy. Instead, take a pencil, a relatively soft HB pencil, colour your key in until it is pencil coloured, and then slide it in and out of the lock. Graphite is an excellent lubricant for locks, and a pencil's made of graphite. Much cheaper than buying graphite lock lubricant, although you can do that too if you want. Everyone has their different ideas about that, and I'm sure there'll be people in the comments telling me off. One final thing with this fancy style cap here, you can use the same trick to lubricate this. You absolutely don't want this to start getting stuck, because then you'll force it and break it. And finally, whatever treatment you use for the paint, make sure you bring it all the way down in here, because the paint's a little bit thin, and clean out any gunk that's got stuck around here. And see that hole there? If you've got access to air, or if you've got a high pressure spray can, blow that out, because that's where any fuel you spill will roll down into a pipe and down onto the floor, rather than staying there and eating your paint. Now that we've done a half-assed job all around the bike, me and my other half are going to get on with cleaning the rest of it properly. And so hopefully that's been helpful for anyone who's got one of these bikes. It's all the places I've found so far. If you know of any other crap traps or problem points on these bikes that you should address when you're doing every couple of month to 6 monthly cleaning, do pop them down in the comments. It'd be really helpful. Otherwise, really like the Interceptor 650. Not a bike I'd have ever bought for myself, but having one thrust into my life by somebody else has given me a kind of an appreciation for them, especially the sound of this one. I'll do a sound video at some point with these tech pipes on there. They are absolutely raucous with the baffles out, and with the baffles in, they're still raucous, but they sound fantastic, and they're just on the right side of obnoxious, for me at least. Wouldn't want them any louder.